Obviously, this isn't Sunday morning. This is Monday. But we didn't get the recording for our last sermon, our third sermon in the Ruth sermon series. And since a lot of folks missed it because of the snow, I decided to re-record it so that you could watch it now here. Because I know, again, a lot of you weren't here. So that's why we are in this situation. That's not why I'm not wearing my robe. That's why it is a little bit more echoey in here. But here you go. We are now in our third week going through the book of Ruth. We started our journey in Moab with two women, Naomi and Ruth, and how both of them had lost their husbands. But Ruth decides to cling to her mother-in-law Naomi and follow her into a foreign land, Israel, forsaking the possibility of safety in Moab as a Moabite woman. That clinging to one another reminds us of the importance of sticking by each other and how we need each other to navigate life's circumstance. Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem just in time for the harvest. Ruth goes out into the fields and hopes to glean out a meager existence for herself and for Naomi. Call it a miracle, call it circumstance, call it whatever you want, but Ruth happens along to a field owner named Boaz. Boaz hears of Ruth's act of hesed, or loving kindness, in sticking with Naomi, and decides to act in hesed towards Ruth by providing her with a safe place to gather food. We talked about hesed, and going above and beyond to show kindness and love to others, beyond what is just expected of us or is our own obligations. We saw how hesed flows out of us because God first shows hesed to us by loving us, no matter what. So now we arrive at chapter 3. Harvest is coming to an end, and while Boaz's kindness has allowed Ruth and Naomi to gather food, Naomi knows that permanent security for Ruth needs to be a priority. Luckily, as we learned in chapter 2, Boaz is actually a relative of Naomi's dead husband. Now, we aren't going to go into ancient Near East estate law today. We'll get to that next week if you're chomping at the bit to hear about it. But for now, it's important to take note that Boaz holds an important key here so that both Ruth and Naomi have a future. So Naomi's plan is to have Ruth marry Boaz. Naomi instructs Ruth to dress up and to go to Boaz. She tells her to lay beside him and uncover his feet. And by the way, because a lot of folks asked me through last week as they were reading through the book of Ruth, the phrase uncover his feet is just that in the original Hebrew language. So it could be the literal meaning of what we're looking at, some sort of cultural significance that we're not quite sure of, or something else. But we'll just leave it at that. Because it really doesn't change our story either way. But Naomi says to simply do this, and he will tell you what to do. Boaz will tell you what to do. Remember that. So Ruth does Naomi's instructions. She finds Boaz on the threshing floor, on the barn floor, if you'd rather, and laid down next to him. Boaz wakes up and finds Ruth and asks her, "Who are you? Who are you?" Now try to imagine the situation that Ruth finds herself in. Here she is, a young woman from the land of Moab. She was taken into a family of foreigners, Israelites, and married one of them. But she lost her husband. She watched all security that she may have had erode away. She watched as her sister-in-law, Orpah, made the decision to return to Moab. That's where Ruth could have gone, found herself a new husband, and remained in the only country she would have known. She instead decides to follow Naomi. Where you go, I will go. She forsook safety for clinging to what is right. She had to work and toil for an existence for herself and Naomi. She had to go into the fields as a foreign woman, a woman whose people were hated by Israel, that were constantly at war with Israel, and she had to hope and pray that she would be able to get enough just to get by. Now here she was, on the threshing floor, with a strange man who, yes, had shown her kindness, but this was a different kind of risk. What if he was mad? What if someone saw them? What if someone thought that some sort of impropriety was going on? She could be outcast of the community. He might just kill her for risking his standing in the community. Here was a foreign woman with no real resources, a widow, one of, if not the lowest rung of the societal ladder, completely at the mercy of this man. She had no real societal agency left, no riches, no power, and in the eyes of the community, no real hope. But Ruth also had no fear. She looks at Boaz and responds, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over me, for you are next of kin." Now, I know that might seem like an innocuous line. We don't really get kind of the meaning just through reading it. But to me, it's the most powerful line in the entire story. I am Ruth, not just a widow, not just a foreigner. I am Ruth, claiming her identity in a society that tries to dehumanize her. Your servant. It seems simple. But by claiming that she was his servant means that she belongs here. You know, too often our society looks at those in the margins, those who may be foreign, and tells them, "You don't belong here." This would be no different with Ruth as a Moabite woman. But to that, she essentially says, "No, I do belong here. I'm a part of this, your household. I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over me." Spread your cloak over me. So easy to read over. But you see, that right there was a marriage proposal. When you spread your cloak over someone in the society, it is a symbol of marriage. And remember, Naomi had told Ruth just to go there and lie down and wait for what Boaz would tell her to do. But instead, Ruth is telling Boaz what to do. Can you imagine this? In a society where as a woman, she would have very little power, as a widow even less, and as a foreigner, well, forget about it. She tells Boaz what to do. She claims agency. She claims her identity. She claims her future, even when society says she has none. She looks in the face of a culture that tries to put her in her place and says, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over me." You see, she clings here to courage. You know, it seems easy to forget in the midst of everything else that is a part of this story just how incredible Ruth really is. Even more incredible is that the hero of this story, a story in the religious book of Israelites, is in fact a Moabite woman. You know, I think there's something to that. That the one who shows the greatest courage is the one that society may discount the most. Of course, this courage does not go unnoticed in our story. Boaz hears Ruth's words, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over me." He then responds, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your hesed is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. For all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman." Boaz sees that Ruth is worthy. But to be honest, I'm not really a big fan of how the NRSV, the version we read here on Sunday mornings or that are in the pews, I'm not really a big fan of how they translate that term. The term worthy woman. You see, the term there is Esat Hael. The more appropriate translation to me is woman of integrity, or even better, woman of valor. Some may read the NRSV and think this woman is just simply worthy of marrying, which is true. But more accurately, Boaz is describing Ruth as extraordinary. Boaz is describing Ruth in terms of extremely high character. Esat Hayel is not a term used very often in Scripture. In fact, it's only used one other time, in reference to Proverbs 31, a description of the perfect woman, which, by the way, in Hebrew versions of the Bible, the book of Ruth falls in right immediately after Proverbs 31, which I don't think is by accident. Now, I know Proverbs 31 has some baggage attached to it in our current culture, but Esat Hayel is the highest compliment of a woman found in the Hebrew vernacular. And it is used to describe a poor Moabite woman. I don't think it gets any better than that. So Boaz essentially says yes to Ruth's marriage proposal, but he does say that there is one other person who is closer in relation to Naomi's family, and that he must be advised and given an opportunity to weigh in. Like I said previously, we'll go into more detail about this whole ancient real estate laws again next week. But I think it's important to mention that Boaz gets points here for being an upstanding guy and making sure that the right thing is done and making sure Ruth doesn't go away empty-handed and gives her some barley to take back to Naomi. But the real story here is Ruth. Now, I know this would typically be the place where I would insert some sort of story from my own life or from someone that I know in order to compare in some sort of way the story of Ruth to the modern day, wrapping up this sermon nice and tight with a platitude or a lesson on how we should react and enact and embody this story in our own lives in order to advance the kingdom of God, because that's what I do. That's my job. But I don't have a story here for you today, folks. Because honestly, I've never even come close to touching the type of intestinal fortitude that it took for Ruth to cling to courage in her situation. Because this took an incredible amount of courage to do what was required of Ruth, to claim a future not just for herself, but for Naomi as well. Because as Boaz points out, by coming to Boaz, Ruth is not chasing after someone who's younger or someone with more riches. She is chasing after the person that can secure a future for Naomi as well. See, this courage is an incredible act of hesed towards Naomi. And she isn't just waiting for it to be handed to her. Ruth goes out and grabs her future right by the throat, even in the face of the impossible or the dangerous. That takes an incredible amount of courage. Courage that shakes mountains. Courage that changes things. Now, I will admit, I've at least heard about this type of courage before, and it seems to follow a similar pattern than the one we see in the book of Ruth. I've seen it in I've heard about it in folks like Rosa Parks, standing up to racism by staying put in her bus seat and sparking a movement that led to civil rights for so many Americans. I've seen it in folks like Malala, who at 11 years old started writing about and shining a light on the need for education for young girls in Pakistan, and then was threatened, intimidated, and even shot in an attempted murder by the Taliban at 16 years old, and still getting up and doing the work necessary to secure a better future for young girls all across the globe. That takes courage. And these two examples of courage are just that, two examples. And there are many more we could explore, but sometimes the biggest acts of courage come from the most unlikely of places, like an African-American woman in 1950s Alabama, a young Pakistani girl, or a poor Moabite woman. So the questions I leave with you today are these. If these extraordinary acts of courage can come from the most unexpected of places, then what is holding you back from showing courage when it is called for, when doing those simple, everyday things in which God has called us to do? What is keeping us from showing courage when the opportunity arises to show love to God and to our neighbor? Where in our lives is it that we need to re-examine where fear is driving the bus rather than courage to do what is right? And no, not what is right in our own eyes, but what is right in God's eyes. How can we show Hesed to those that need it the most, the least of these in our society? And I'll also leave you with good news. As we see from our story today, even when things seem at its darkest, if we cling to courage, we might be surprised at the light that God shines through in that darkness in order to bring us hope. A hope that we will see is worth clinging to.